Harlan Voss was 83 years old and dying in a hospice room in Roswell, New Mexico, on the afternoon of March 14, 2008, when he told his daughter, for the first time in 61 years, what his hands had done in the summer of 1947. He had been 22 then, a supply sergeant assigned to load crates onto flatbed trucks parked behind a hangar at the Roswell Army Air Field. He told her the material had not shattered when it was folded. He told her it had returned. That is the sentence she wrote down, in pencil, on the back of a hospice intake form, because there was no other paper within reach, and she did not want to leave the room to look for any. It returned. 61 years is the number I keep returning to, because it is not simply the length of Harlan Voss's silence, it is the length of time a single flat sentence sat folded inside a man who, otherwise, by every account, lived an unremarkable and talkative life, who told fishing stories at diners, who argued about high school football, who was, his daughter says, the kind of man who filled silences rather than left them. He filled 61 years of silences with everything except this one. I want to be careful here, because deathbed testimony is a genre that invites belief the way a dim room invites a shape to become a face. But I have spent a long time now sitting with what Harlan Voss left behind, and I want to walk through it with you the way I walked through it myself, slowly and without deciding in advance what it means. What remains of Harlan Voss's account is not a file. It is a small, specific pile of objects, and I think it matters that you know exactly what is in it before I tell you what any of it might mean. There is a cassette tape, 90 minutes, recorded by his daughter on a handheld recorder she borrowed from her church, capturing 51 minutes of speech before the batteries failed. There is the hospice intake form with its pencil sentence on the back. There is a single black and white photograph, undated but plausibly summer 1947, showing a young man in fatigues standing beside an open crate, his face turned slightly from the camera. There is a shipping manifest fragment, one torn quarter of a page, typewritten, listing weights and destinations in a column that ends mid-entry. And there is a 2-inch square of waxed packing paper, folded into eighths, that Harlan Voss kept in a cigar box in his closet for 61 years, and that his daughter did not understand the significance of until much later. I will come back to that square of paper. I want you to know now that it exists, and that I do not yet know what to do with it. Let me start not with the dying man in 2008, but with the younger one, because the account only makes sense if we go back to where it started. In the first week of July 1947, Harlan Voss was assigned to a small detail tasked with loading debris, that is the word used in his own later account, debris, never fragments, never wreckage, recovered from a ranch northwest of town, onto trucks bound for a hangar. He was not, by his own telling, present at the recovery site. He never claimed to have seen a crash, a craft, or a body. He claimed only to have handled, for perhaps 4 hours across 2 separate loading shifts, material that had already been gathered and crated by other men. This distinction matters. Harlan Voss was not a man who claimed to have seen the extraordinary. He was a man who claimed to have touched it, briefly, with his hands, in the course of ordinary work. He described the material in careful, almost clinical terms on the tape, terms his daughter says did not sound like a man performing a story, because he kept stopping to correct himself, the way a person does when they are trying to get a physical memory exactly right, rather than trying to make it compelling. He said one piece, roughly the size of a dinner plate, was thinner than paper, and could not be cut, dented, or burned by a cigarette lighter one of the other men tried on it as a joke. He said that when it was crumpled in the fist, and he demonstrated this, his daughter says, with his own hand, even in the hospice bed, even at 83. It did not stay crumpled. It opened itself back out. Not sprang, not snapped. Opened, slowly, the way a hand opens when sleep leaves it. That is the detail I keep returning to, because it is the kind of detail a person does not invent for effect. A man inventing a dramatic story reaches for drama, a light, a scream, a body. Harlan Voss reached for the physical behavior of a folded piece of material in his own palm, described with the specificity of someone recalling a sensation rather than constructing a scene. There is a gap in what he could account for. Between the end of the first loading shift at approximately 4 in the afternoon and the start of the second, he told his daughter he could not say where he had been for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Not that he had forgotten. He was explicit about the distinction. Forgetting, he said, was not what this was. He said he remembered walking toward the mess hall. He said his next clear memory was standing outside the same hangar, in the dark, with the second loading detail already assembling around him. 1 hour and 40 minutes. He returned to that number 3 separate times across the recording. Always the same figure, never rounded up or down, the way a person repeats a number they have turned over so many times in private that it has become fixed, load-bearing, no longer subject to memory's usual erosion. I want to be careful here, because missing time is the single most familiar shape in this genre, and familiarity is not evidence. A gap in a man's afternoon, 83 years old and 61 years removed from the event, proves very little on its own. But I'm not telling you about Harlan Voss in isolation. I am telling you about Harlan Voss because 2 other people, independently, describe pieces of the same afternoon and evening. People who did not know each other, who gave their accounts decades apart, in different states, to different interviewers, and whose accounts rhyme without ever quite matching, which is, I think, more interesting than if they matched exactly. The first is a man named Curtis Ambrose, who was 18 in the summer of 1947 and worked the same loading detail as Harlan Voss for one of the 2 shifts. Ambrose gave a recorded interview to a regional oral history project in 1994, 14 years before Harlan Voss spoke at all, and he is on record, independently, with no apparent knowledge of Voss's later account, describing a piece of material that wouldn't stay bent. He used almost exactly that phrase. He also described, unprompted, a silence in the loading yard that he found strange enough to mention 50 years later. No truck engines idling, no radio traffic from the base, no insects on a July evening in the desert, when insects should have been constant. Ambrose died in 2003, 5 years before Voss spoke, and never knew that another man from the same detail would later describe returning material in nearly identical language. The second corroborating account comes from someone much closer to Harlan Voss in his final weeks, a hospice nurse named Priya Deshmukh, who cared for him during the last 11 days of his life, and who noted, in her clinical charting, something she found professionally worth recording: a specific and consistent physical response whenever an aircraft passed overhead.
Roswell's hospice sits under a light general aviation flight path, and Deshmukh documented that Voss's heart rate rose measurably and his hands moved to fold themselves. She used that word in her own notes, fold, every time a small plane crossed above the building, for 11 consecutive days. A response she had not observed in any other patient in 9 years of hospice work. She was not present for his 1947 service. She had no access to his daughter's tape until much later. Her only data was a dying man's body reacting to something in the sky, 61 years on. I am not prepared to tell you these 3 accounts describe the same object with certainty. I am not prepared to dismiss the fact that they describe it independently in the same register: thinness, an unwillingness to remain deformed, a silence around the event that none of the 3 witnesses can locate a source for. That proves nothing on its own. But I want to say plainly what I think it is not. It is not 3 unrelated men describing 3 unrelated afternoons. It is not coincidence in isolation. It is accumulation. And accumulation is the word this story keeps handing me, whether I want it or not. There is a third figure, and I want to introduce her carefully because her role in this account is different from the other 2. Her name is Lorraine Fetch, and she was, from 1998 until her death in 2011, a materials science consultant occasionally retained by regional museums to examine unusual donated artifacts before accession. In 2009, 1 year after Harlan Voss's death, his daughter, settling the estate,
brought Fetch the square of waxed packing paper from the cigar box, along with a residue sample scraped from its inner fold, uncertain whether either was worth preserving. Fetch examined the residue once, in a single afternoon consultation that was never formally written up as a report, and told the daughter, according to the daughter's later recollection, that the material was consistent with standard 1940s packing paper in every respect except one: a faint metallic patterning on the interior fold that she could not immediately identify and that she intended to examine further. She died 18 months later of an unrelated illness, and no further examination was ever completed. Her notes from that single consultation, 3 handwritten pages, were donated to a regional historical society, along with the rest of her working files, and are not present in the society's current inventory. They were logged as received. They are not there now. There is one more object I have not yet described, and I am naming it now only to set it aside again, because I do not yet know where it belongs in this account. Among the items in the cigar box was a single brass button, standard military issue, with no insignia and no unit marking, its shank slightly bent, as though it had once been pried rather than cut from a garment. Harlan Voss never mentioned it on the tape. His daughter cannot say when it entered the box, or whether it belonged to him at all. I will come back to it, briefly, later, though I want to be honest that I may not be able to tell you what it means even then. This is the pattern I want to name directly, because I think naming it is more honest than gesturing at it. What survives of this case does not simply go missing. It goes missing in a specific way, again and again. Received and then absent, examined and then unwritten, spoken and then unrecorded past the battery's death. A tape that runs out at 51 minutes. A researcher's notes that were logged in and are not there now. A manifest that ends mid-entry, mid-word, as though someone stopped typing rather than finished the page. Any one of these is an administrative accident. I want to be careful here, because administrative accidents happen constantly, in every archive, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything extraordinary. But a cluster of them, all touching the same 6 hours of one man's life, is not the same claim as a single missing folder. It is a pattern, with an edge to it. And I have come to think that edges tell you more than gaps do, because a gap is simply an absence, while an edge is the place where something specific stopped. I said I would come back to the square of waxed paper, and I want to do that now, because it is where the word Harlan Voss used, returned, earns its second life. 3 witnesses used variations of the same idea. 3 states, if you count where each account surfaced. New Mexico, where Voss died, a transcript archived in Nevada, where Ambrose's 1994 interview is held, and a historical society in Texas, where Fetch's incomplete notes were logged and lost. The same word, in 3 mouths that never met. Voss said the material returned to its shape. Ambrose said it wouldn't stay bent. Fetch, in her final consultation, described a patterning that persisted through the fold. Visible, she said, no matter how many times the paper had apparently been creased and flattened again over 61 years in a cigar box. I want to sit with that word for a moment, because I think it is doing more work than a simple description of a physical material. To return is not merely to persist. It is to go somewhere and come back changed by the going, or unchanged despite it. And it is not yet clear to me which of those Harlan Voss meant. What would it mean for an object to refuse the shape a hand gives it, decade after decade, in a box, in the dark, unobserved? What would it mean for a man to carry in his own body the same refusal? To fold himself shut around a memory for 61 years, and then, in his final 11 days, still flinch at the sound of something passing overhead, as though some part of him had never stopped expecting a return of another kind. I do not think Harlan Voss meant to make that connection explicitly. I think it is possible he could not have separated the 2 meanings, even if he tried, because the word had done its folding work on him long before he ever spoke it aloud to his daughter. There is a detail I held back, and I want to give it to you now, because I think it changes how the whole account should sit with you. Harlan Voss's daughter mentioned, almost as an aside during a later conversation, that her father had refused to fly for his entire adult life, not out of any stated fear of crashing, which is the ordinary shape that fear takes, but specifically, in his own words to her once in the 1980s, because he did not like being somewhere he could not verify. She had never understood the remark. She assumed it was some private eccentricity, unconnected to anything. It was not until she found, going through his effects after his death, a second item she had not mentioned to anyone before. A small, torn corner from that same shipping manifest, kept separately from the fragment already known, folded inside his wallet, worn soft at the creases from being carried for decades, that she understood her father had spent 61 years keeping two matching torn pieces of the same page in two different places, never reunited, as though some part of him needed the record kept apart from itself. On that scrap, in typewriter ink faded nearly to nothing, is a single handwritten notation in the margin, not typed. Return authorized. Nothing else. No date fully legible, no name. 2 words, in pencil, on a torn corner a dying man carried against his hip for 61 years. There is the brass button, too, which I said I would come back to. His daughter found, in the same conversation where she described the manifest scrap, a detail she had never connected to it before. Her father kept the button in his shirt pocket, not the cigar box, for the first several years after his return home, and only moved it into the box alongside the paper and the manifest fragment sometime in the early 1950s, around the same time, as best she can date it, that he stopped speaking about the war years at all in any context, even the ordinary ones. No mess hall stories, no complaints about officers, nothing. A man who otherwise filled silences went quiet about that entire period in the same year he put a bent, unmarked button away in a box and did not take it out again for the rest of his life. I do not know whose button it was. I am not prepared to tell you it means anything beyond what it plainly is, which is a small piece of brass a man could not throw away and would not display. I am not prepared to dismiss the timing either. I want to be careful here, because I do not know what those 2 words authorized, or who wrote them, or whether they refer to Harlan Voss's own reassignment, to a shipment, or to something else the record no longer carries. I am not prepared to tell you that this note confirms anything. I am not prepared to dismiss the fact that a man built his entire private cosmology, apparently, around a word he could not stop finding in front of him, on the debris, in his own mouth, and finally, on a scrap of paper he kept against his own skin until he died. What do we know at the end of this? We know a man loaded crates for 4 hours across 2 shifts in July of 1947 and could not account for 1 hour and 40 minutes of that evening, a gap he named the same way 3 separate times across 51 recorded minutes before the tape ran out. We know 2 other people, independently, decades apart, described the same material in nearly the same terms he did, without ever having heard his account. We know a materials consultant found something she could not immediately explain in a residue sample, and died before she could explain it, and that her notes on the matter are logged as received and are not there now. What we cannot know is what any of it means, and I do not think that not knowing is a failure of the record. I think it may be the record's most honest feature. I keep thinking about the square of waxed paper, folded and unfolded for 61 years by a man who would not fly and could not explain why. And I keep thinking about the phrase "return authorized," sitting in a wallet against a hip for 6 decades, worn soft by the same hands that once, briefly, held something that would not stay bent. I do not know what returned, or to where, or whether the word belongs to the material, to the man, or to some accounting neither of them ever fully understood. What I know is that a dying man spoke 1 sentence after 61 years of silence, and that the sentence he chose, out of everything he could have said, was about something coming back. Somewhere, in a drawer that is not in the inventory it was logged into, there may be 3 more pages that would tell us what Lorraine Fetch saw in that fold before she ran out of time to finish looking. I do not have those pages. I have a cigar box, a torn manifest in 2 pieces that were never reunited, and a word that 3 strangers reached for independently across 60 years and 3 states without ever once comparing notes. The last image I have is the one his daughter gave me, almost without meaning to, near the end of our conversation. Her father, in the final days, lying with his hand slightly open on the blanket, fingers curled, and then, without his seeming to notice, slowly opening again, over and over, the whole shape of the motion taking perhaps 4 or 5 seconds each time, unbidden, unwilled, and never once, in 11 days, staying